The recording is going. Happy end of March, everyone, and welcome to Dr. Madison Swayne's talk on Brownfield Redevelopment. It's really nice to see folks turning out. I know we're all starting to get a little bit exhausted by the ongoing semester and pandemic, but we really appreciate your participation today. The session will be recorded and posted to our website at the Gibbs College of Architecture. And I'd like to take an opportunity to thank them for hosting this event today and for allowing us to get Maddie here to speak a little bit about her work. She's a dear friend of mine at San Diego State University, a current assistant professor there on tenure track, working at the intersection of automated computing methods, primary data, looking at mixed methods using big data, and thinking, I think, mostly about environmental justice, really. Her research examines urban form, real estate development, environmental policies, and nuisance, and the ways that we continue to see, particularly in the United States, these conditions exacerbated and reproduced, particularly for communities of color as we think about issues of environmental justice. She teaches courses in environmental planning, land use and environmental law, and sustainable urbanism at San Diego State. And before starting there, she and I were both part of a PhD program at the University of Southern California. I think she graduated a few years after I did, but we both studied spatial planning there. She has her master's and bachelor's in environmental studies, also from USC. And it's really my pleasure to welcome her today and listen to her talk on brownfield redevelopment and her experience in California. So I'll let you take it away, Maddie. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Bryce. Can you guys hear me okay? And just give me a thumbs up. Cool. I'm going to share my screen with you. All right. I think that's going to work. So hi, thank you again so much for inviting me to talk today. It's exciting to be here, even if in a virtual setting. Like Bryce said, I'm Madison Swayne. I'm an assistant professor of city planning at the San Diego State University School of Public Affairs. I have my PhD in urban planning and development and my bachelor's and master's in environmental science. Just a quick overview of my talk today, where we're going. I'll give you an introduction to myself and some of my experiences in the field. Then just talk about what are brownfields, what do we do about them, funding and programming availability related to brownfields, and then some examples of best practices or successful brownfield redevelopment projects. Do you want me to admit folks? Okay.
I got it, Maddie. I'll take care of the admin. Yeah.
Cool. So before I dive into the content I've prepared for you specifically on brownfields, I do just want to spend a little bit more time talking about my experience and how I came to be interested in brownfields. Like I mentioned before, I originally studied to be an environmental scientist. And so with my degree there, I started working as an environmental scientist at a large national environmental consulting firm, where I was on a team of scientists and engineers on environmental remediation team. And so what that means is that we were often contracted by local governments or governmental agencies, sometimes even property owners, to come out to various sites in order to identify and assess environmental contamination at the site, and then prepare and implement remediation or cleanup plans. And so while I was doing this work as an environmental consultant, working in remediation, I realized that the geographic distribution of brownfield sites was not at all random, and the sites that we were being called back to again and again were clustered in low-income neighborhoods with large non-white populations. And so this realization brought me back to school for my PhD in urban planning and got me really interested in questions about environmental justice and patterns of environmental harm across our communities. So now a proud city planner, I see our role in the field as one of really being focused on developing quality environments for folks to live, work, play, etc. And I think that this focus on quality communities is really the main point of urban planning, And I use this as the basis for my thinking about brownfields and why they're so important to sort of tune into and think about opportunities at these sites. Since leaving the consulting world and coming to academia, I've worked on a variety of different projects, one of which I've looked at the impacts of environmental contamination on things like local property value appreciation rates, and some other topics related to this problem. I'm not going to spend any time today really talking about my research, because I do just want to give you guys all an introduction to brownfields and what we can do with them in our communities. Also, I think, should we hold questions to the end, Bryce? Do you want to field questions? Do you want me to just take them as they come?
Yeah, so Maddie, I've sent a note for people to drop things in the chat, and then I think we're going to have some time at the end for if people actually want to engage in a little bit of discussion. So,
okay, cool, that works for me. What is a brownfield? Brownfield is a property, the expansion, redevelopment, or reuse of which may be complicated by the presence or potential presence of a hazardous substance, pollutant, or contaminant. So that's the definition that comes from the US EPA. And the EPA estimates that there are more than 450,000 brownfields in the US. And the EPA really approaches brownfields from the perspective of cleaning up these sites and reinvesting in these properties as opportunities, as really economic development opportunities. So opportunities to increase local tax bases, facilitate job growth, and also utilize existing infrastructure. And redevelopment of brownfields, not every brownfield redevelopment story is a success story, but when done properly, brownfield redevelopment can take development pressures off of undeveloped land, open land, and serve to improve and protect the environment. Now, before I dive deeper into how we identify and assess and clean up brownfields, I want to first spend some time talking about the importance of understanding the crossover between environmental justice concerns and brownfields. Brownfield redevelopment has received a lot of attention, both positive and negative. But in general, the EPA and other entities leading brownfield redevelopment often couch their arguments for redevelopment on opportunities for economic returns. However, brownfield sites, like any sort of environmental hazard, are not evenly distributed across space, with low-income minority communities generally having higher brownfields burdens in their communities. So in the United States, we have big chunks of land with high densities of brownfield sites, and those are neighborhoods where we see low-income minority folks residing. And so it's really important that we integrate conversations around environmental justice issues into the conversation on brownfield redevelopment, because doing brownfield redevelopment is really a form of doing environmental justice work, and we need to come to brownfield redevelopment with that in mind. And so when we think about doing work related to brownfields, I think it's important to center our work around the following questions. I'm not going to spend a lot of time on these questions here today, but I'm happy to talk more about them later on. Just thinking about to what extent local neighborhoods, who's living there, how do we prioritize which sites get cleaned up first, how are local economic development benefits distributed, are local folks kind of getting value capture or benefits being accrued elsewhere, and then how can the public participate in the brownfields process? So not just consulting communities like, hey, what do you think, but actually getting communities deeply involved in this redevelopment process so that we build outcomes that are mutually beneficial for existing residents and also some of our economic development goals we might have. So with these environmental justice concerns in mind, I'll just kind of walk you through the general process for brownfields identification, assessment, cleanup and remediation, and redevelopment. So step one is figuring out where are all the brownfields. This is a common question that comes from environmental regulators, city planners, academics, community members. And I think it's a much more complicated and nuanced question than it might originally seem. Because brownfield sites aren't just sites that have environmental contamination, but can have perceived environmental contamination. Site identification really includes some incorporation of qualitative impressions of the site. So even if there might not be environmental contamination in the soil or groundwater, local folks might still perceive a specific parcel to be a brown site just because it might look like there might be some problems. And so brownfield site identification is not just taking a whole bunch of soil samples and placing the title brownfield on any parcel where you get a hit for some sort of toxin in the soil. It really involves some of these more like qualitative measures of how a specific site might make you feel. I've heard brownfields described as sites with environmental character. And I think that's kind of apt because they have character and we don't really know what's there, but we have this sort of feeling of, oh, that might be a brownfield. And so as I'm kind of talking about brownfields, maybe you're thinking about your neighborhood. Maybe there's an old gas station or an old car wash or a facility that just has kind of sat vacant for a long time. And there may or may not be environmental contamination there, but those types of sites might be things that we would identify as brownfields. On top of that, just in terms of like the difference between the qualitative and the quantitative identification of brownfield sites, many properties do not want their property to be put on an official brownfields list. And this is because of fears of costly liability for site cleanup and redevelopment. And so for this reason, some cities do not explicitly maintain brownfield site lists and instead maintain inventories of sites that they may say are available for redevelopment. And so you can kind of see how we play around with the words for these types of things. So there's no real standard criteria set, and we might call brownfield sites just simply redevelopment sites to avoid fears of liability and costs associated with redevelopment. But really, when it comes down to it, it is the community that identifies a property as a brownfield. So, you know, we could have technicians come into every single community across the United States and do quantitative analysis trying to figure out where brownfield sites are. But by talking to community members and getting involved in the community, I think that's actually the best way to kind of judge the status of neighborhood sites as brownfields or not. There are maps like this that exist. So this is just a screenshot from the EPA. I have the link under that image of some identified sites in the state of Oklahoma. And so you can see a variety of different sites that have different environmental classifications, some with actual measured environmental contamination and others that may not actually have measured environmental problems on site. And so you can go on to the EPA website and look around at the sites that may have already been identified as brownfields. So once you've identified the brownfield sites in your community, it's time to actually assess what's going on at those sites. So with assessment, the first step in understanding how to redevelop a brownfield is to really develop a solid understanding of the known or suspected extent and magnitude of environmental contamination. And so we can have environmental contamination in soils, groundwater, and air. And so oftentimes when you're doing brownfield assessment, you'll bring an environmental consultant on site to do what's called a phase 1 or phase 2 environmental site assessment to look into soil, groundwater, and identify potential for fate and transport of contaminants of concern. And so you might have things like contaminated soils, contaminated groundwater, contaminated surface water. You might just have some like sort of gross contamination issues where maybe you see like little oil pools or, you know, really runs the whole gamut of what you might find when you do an environmental assessment at a brownfield site. Or sometimes you'll go out and you'll do an environmental assessment at a brownfield site and you'll actually find no real sources of contamination, but that doesn't disqualify it from being a brownfield site. It's still classified as such, and there's still redevelopment opportunities there. But these assessments can be very simple, to going out and finding nothing, to very complicated and going out and finding multiple pathways for human exposure to contaminants. So after assessment, depending on the contaminants of concern and the desired future reuse of the brownfields property, environmental remediation can look very different. So this was a site that I worked at in 2015 or 16, where we were actually having to excavate tons and tons of contaminated soil and move it off-site for disposal. So a lot of the cleanup looks at potential risk. So relatively low risk sites are going to be where you're planning to do some sort of commercial or industrial activity. The idea there being that if you had a site for commercial or industrial use, people aren't going to be living there. They're going to be spending less time there. You might be able to engineer ways to kind of keep people safe from environmental problems. But if you want to build things like green space or residential, you are likely going to need to do more cleanup, just because you'll have local residents there, maybe some sorts of sensitive receptors like pregnant women or children. And so you'll need to be more careful, more sort of in depth with your cleanup to make sure that you can safely redevelop that land in the capacity that you have in mind. And then we have a variety of different remediation technologies available to clean up contaminated properties. The technology that's selected for redevelopment of a brownfield will largely depend on cost characteristics and contamination characteristics of the site. It's a really awesome opportunity when you can find synergies between remediation techniques and your future reuse plan. So for example, if you need to excavate deep soils, like in that image I'd shown you a little bit ago, you may be able to pair that excavation with the creation of underground parking or something like that. And so you can think about ways to marry an remediation technique with a future reuse. And so I've just kind of listed some common remediation techniques here. Depending on what your contaminants of concern are, you might choose one or multiple of these in order to remediate the site you're looking at. Before I get into showing you some examples of brownfield redevelopments that have been successful, I want to pause and talk about the funding available for brownfields. So the EPA does have a variety of grant programs available for assisting brownfields redevelopment. So the first of which are brownfields assessment grants. So these grants support eligible entities as they undertake the process of inventory, characterizing, assessing, and conducting reuse planning for brownfield sites in a community. Applications for the assessment grants open up every fiscal year. I think applications are typically due in October. And eligible entities can apply for up to $300,000 to assess contaminated sites. And then if you actually form a coalition, which I'll get into a little bit later, so if you form a coalition of folks who are interested in this assessment grant, you can actually apply for up to $600,000 through the EPA assessment grant program. So this is a really powerful grant program for just kind of figuring out what sorts of brownfields may exist in your community. The next grant program they offer is the Brownfield Cleanup Grant. So these cleanup grants provide funding to actually carry out cleanup activities at one or more brownfield sites. These, I think, are capped at $500,000. And in order to qualify for a cleanup grant, you have to have already identified a site that does have documented contaminants of concern at that site. The EPA also has a revolving loan fund. So these grants are up to $1 million. and you have to repay these. So unlike the grants, there is a repayment structure to these. But these are really great when you have sort of like a public-private partnership where you're pretty confident that redevelopment of the site is going to generate new revenues. And so you see the revolving loan funds getting used for things like that. And then the multi-purpose grants provide funding to carry out a range of activities. So inventory, characterization, and assessment of brownfield sites. These are a little bit larger, and I have less familiarity with the multi-purpose grants. I've been involved in applications for assessment and cleanup grants in the past, but not for the revolving loan or the multi-purpose grants. But all of the information on these brownfields funding programs through the EPA are available on the EPA website. Each US state is nested into an EPA region. So Oklahoma, you guys are in region 6. So I unfortunately don't know who your contacts are in your brownfields office. If you're in region 9, I could tell you who to call. But all of this information is public on the EPA's website. And I found in general that the folks at the regional offices are pretty eager to help if you have specific questions, if you're applying to one of these grant programs. They're usually pretty able and willing to help you out. So brownfields funding is, I think it's really important when thinking about funding to talk about coalition building. And I'm going to circle back to coalition building at the end here. But, small towns or communities that have just, suffered from generations of disinvestment may lack the resources necessary to pursue brownfields grants. And coalitions can provide a solution here where you bring a wide variety of people together to form a coalition and go after some of these funds. And so you can have community groups, nonprofit organizations, for-profit organizations, all sort of working together and bringing their diverse skills to put together some really compelling grant applications. Because these grant applications are kind of big, they take a lot of time. You need to have sufficient capacity in order to submit one of these grant proposals. But coalition building is one way to kind of make that happen if your specific organization that you're at might lack capacity just on its own. So I want to show you some examples of successful brownfields redevelopment. So my first 2 examples are where brownfields have been converted into recreation areas. So I don't know if anybody has been to this site here. This is Gasworks Park in Seattle, Washington. So in the 1970s, the city of Seattle hired a local landscape architect to kind of reconfigure. This is a 20-acre park. It was formerly the site of the Seattle Gas Light Company. And so the city purchased the site, hired this local landscape architect, and rather than just removing the polluted soil from the site, they remediated the soil through the installation of these towers that you see here. And so they were able to kind of remediate the site and incorporate those remediation techniques into the design of the park. And it's this really kind of like Mad Max looking place. It's really fun to hang out there and really, really killer views of the water nearby. So if you're ever in Seattle, I do recommend you stop by Gasworks Park because it's a really cool example of a brownfield where they've maintained some of the old infrastructure that maybe you would have been tempted to just tear down, but it gives it a really unique sort of character. And then Discovery Green in Houston is another example of a brownfield turned into a really great recreation area. So prior to redevelopment, this site here was really just sort of a concrete eyesore, and it's now a really beautiful and vibrant destination for local folks to come and hang out at the park. And they've done a lot of kind of economic, they've tried to track the economic impacts of this park redevelopment, and they've estimated that redevelopment of this park alone has brought close to $500 million in development money to the surrounding community. So really decent evidence that redeveloping this brownfield site has in fact brought really quality economic development to the neighborhood. Another example is transforming a brownfield to a food site. So as you may know, way too many Americans lack access to healthy food. Bryce knows this for sure. But it's notoriously difficult to make grocery stores pencil, like from a real estate development perspective, to make grocery stores pencil in neighborhoods that need them most. And so this image here is from Oakland, California, where a community food store was built at the site of a former tile and granite showroom. So there actually wasn't any serious environmental contamination there, but the site was perceived as environmentally hazardous, thus it qualified as a brownfield site. And so there was just certain stigma surrounding the property just because of its previous use as a tile and granite showroom. And so I really like this example because the financing structure for this property was really interesting. So they did something called a direct public offering, where the public was offered direct shares in the project. There were no investment minimums on income, and the average investment from folks was about $3,000. Some people put in as little as $1,000. And so they kind of crowdfunded and put together the requisite money to build what is now a very successful community food store, bringing high quality, healthy produce to a place that was previously basically a food swamp with just lots of convenience stores and liquor stores, and not a lot of opportunities for people to get their hands on fresh fruits and vegetables. You also see transformation of brownfields to food and agriculture sites in the form of urban farms as well. And there's a lot of great examples of those online. And I should mention that the EPA maintains a database of all of the projects they've ever funded. And so they have a really nice kind of library of brownfield redevelopment projects that have been funded through a variety of their programs. So if you were maybe thinking about taking up a brownfield project, you might want to just spend some time on the EPA's brownfield site, looking at some previously funded projects they have in their library there. Another example, turning brownfields into commercial opportunities. So this is a local example for me. This is in National City, California. National City, California is a very low income, highly diverse neighborhood located right next to our port. And so lots of environmental contamination issues, a variety of different kind of mixed uses, but not in the good sense of the word. So heavy industry being abutted up right next to residential, and all sorts of kind of zoning problems there. But this property was formerly, it was a leather dyeing and tanning facility, then it was a cabinet manufacturing facility, then it was an auto repair shop, and then I think it was like a smelting facility or something crazy. So just a lot of kind of incompatible uses, all having taken place on this single plot of land. So in 1999, National City purchased the site. It sat vacant for 11 years. Definitely, the community conceived of it as a brownfield site. And so the city later went out and got a grant from the Center for Creative Land Recycling. They're a really awesome group that also provides funding and guidance on brownfields redevelopment. And so with that grant, they did some environmental investigation at the site. They did, in fact, find elevated levels of heavy metals and petroleum hydrocarbons. With this site, because there had been so many previous uses with a variety of different property owners and the site just kind of changing hands so many times, they weren't able to identify a single party as responsible. And so they couldn't kind of go after somebody for money to help with redevelopment of the site. But what National City did is they sought funds again from the Center for Creative Land Recycling and received one of those revolving loans from the EPA to remove the contaminated soils. And just doing that was kind of enough to get local development interests interested in the site. And so a local developer later came in and brought this hotel and some other commercial uses to the site as well. And so sometimes that's all it takes, is just getting contaminated soils out there, out of the site, so that local development doesn't see it as such a risky investment, and they feel more compelled to come in and kind of do their own sort of development work. One more example, so transforming brownfields to mixed use. So if you remember this photo from before, this is one of the sites that I worked at. This is the former Marine Corps Air Station in Irvine, California. So it was a big military complex. I think it's like 1,900 acres, so it's a huge site with a lot of very complicated environmental cleanup things going on simultaneously. So they had massive amounts of underground storage tanks. There was heavy metals in soils. There was just like everything imaginable that could go wrong with the environment was kind of happening here at the air station in El Toro. And what they've done slowly but surely is they're transforming this really large former air station into a mixed use development. So they've completed the park, most of the park, which you see down here on the right. And then they've also started to build some housing here. And the long-term plan is to kind of create this mixed use integrated community. Of course, they had to be very careful about where they located the park and where they located the house, just in relation to previous contamination. But they were able to find some space for all these different uses. And this one I think is still going on. I'm not sure when they're going to be done. So the last example I have for you, this is another project in National City. Sorry, you're getting a lot of National City examples, but that's close to home for me. So this was they did some habitat restoration. So there was a 14-acre site shown here in red in the heart of National City. And so you have a creek running through the site, but then a whole bunch of incompatible land uses going on down here. This is the southeast corner of the site. And so National City had this vision of turning this into affordable housing and transit-oriented development alongside some habitat restoration along the creek there. And so building the affordable housing, the habitat restoration, and the transit-oriented development was really imperative to this community just because of the socioeconomic conditions in National City. You can see some of the local statistics. City in the table refers to National City. And so there was a lot of interest from local community members and city government itself to transform this site into something that would really serve local community interests. And so they put together a really nice broad coalition of stakeholders. So they have the Environmental Health Coalition, which is a local environmental justice community action org, churches, schools, neighborhood council, Paradise Creek Foundation, Westside TOD developers, those are private real estate developers, and individual landowners all came together to reimagine what would happen on this 14 acres here. And so they've completed restoration of the creek, and we now have what they call it Paradise Creek Educational Park. So that's kind of going in that diagonal across the site that I showed you on the previous slide. They've also built a community garden there on the site and are now looking ahead to building just over 200 units of affordable housing on the site as well. Another really creative thing they did with this Westside TOD project in National City is they created an amortization plan. And so what that is it's a tool for the city to prioritize the relocation of incompatible industrial uses to more appropriate locations. And so the plan is to take some of those heavy industrial uses in this site and relocate them to places where they're better suited, so they're not right up against this really key property where they want folks to be able to live right next to that recreational area and also right next to our public transit system. Last thing I'll say about coalition opportunities, I think this is just really important, and I think local communities that are interested in doing brownfields redevelopment, it's never too early to start on coalition building because there's just so much power here. So some ideas of who you might want to build a coalition with if you're interested in taking up some of this work, thinking about environmental justice and community organizations, city and county governments, tribal governments, regulatory agencies, nonprofit organizations, for-profit organizations, and universities. And as of this year, actually, universities can apply for these EPA grant programs. And so universities can partner with local cities or communities, because a lot of our universities already have offices that put together grants all the time. And so I think that's a really nice new window that the EPA has opened up by allowing universities to get involved in the grant making process. So just some closing thoughts. What I want you to take away is this idea that brownfields are sites that have redevelopment potential. They may or may not have environmental challenges. There may just be perceived environmental challenges. It doesn't really matter if you think there might be an environmental challenge there, we can classify it as a brownfield site. There are funding resources available to address brownfield sites, mostly through the US EPA, but smaller grant programs do exist. Again, coalition building for brownfield redevelopment is incredibly important, especially in neighborhoods that are not well resourced. And then brownfield redevelopment is not a one-size-fits-all solution. So when you're doing brownfield redevelopment, you should consider things like local conditions, local assets, existing infrastructure, and community needs. It's also not a one-size-fits-all solution because depending on what your contaminants of concern are, if there are any at all, you're going to need a variety of different environmental remediation or technical techniques to get that site to a place where you can actually start to think about redevelopment. Last thing before I wrap up and take questions, I just want to mention that the National Brownfields Conference is coming to Oklahoma City this fall. So if you're interested in brownfields work, I encourage you to attend. I do think I'll be there. And it's going to be taking place, so it's kind of meta. The conference is taking place at the Oklahoma City Convention Center, which itself is a redeveloped brownfield site. So I think that's pretty cool. The conference is sponsored by the EPA and is just a really nice large gathering of stakeholders focused on cleaning up and reutilizing these brownfield sites. And so conference topics include information on brownfields grant programs, creative placemaking, funding and financing for community revitalization, resiliency, sustainability, all sorts of topics relevant to brownfields and brownfields redevelopment. If you need to contact me, that's my email there in the top right corner. And then I can also share these slides, but these link out to some online resources you can take a look at if you're interested in doing brownfields work. But I guess I will open it up to questions. If I can figure out how to unshare my screen. Let's see.
Thank you, Maddie. It was great to hear. And thanks for plugging the Brownfields Conference.
Of course. I have no vested interest in plugging it, but I do think folks should go.
Yeah, our students should go. It'd be great for them. Anyone have any questions or things they'd like to chat about with Maddie? Yeah, Bethany.
I couldn't unmute there for a second. Sorry. When you were talking about EPA grants and how in order to get like a cleanup grant, you have to have already identified your site as a brownfield site. But when you're talking like what would qualify as proper identification or classification, since you were kind of saying people can just perceive it to be a brownfield site, and so we call it that. So just really curious about what would be needed to identify it as a brownfield site if you're going to pursue straight to the cleanup grant and skip the assessment grant. Right.
So the cleanup grant is specifically for sites that do have environmental contamination. And so, you know, previous to getting a cleanup grant, you would need to do what's called a phase 1 or phase 2 environmental site assessment and have identified actual contaminants of concern.
Like in the soil and stuff like that, or water?
Exactly, yep.
Are there any types of sites that just automatically make it a brownfield, like old gas station or old, you know, an old tannery and stuff like that?
I don't think there's like a one size fits all rule. Gas stations often end up on these lists, but maybe you had a gas station that actually didn't have a leaking underground storage tank and is completely fine. And so I don't want to say like this type of site is always contaminated, because it's just hard to say depending on how the site has been used in the past.
And then you said there were smaller grants available through other organizations?
Yeah, so the Community Land Recycling, cclr.org, is linked on my slide. They offer some grants. Sometimes also you'll just see like small calls for, you know, grant applications. CCLR, if you are applying for an EPA grant, will also like help review your application, which is a nice resource they offer. But I'd say besides the EPA, that's probably the next biggest one that I've seen.
Okay, thank you.
Of course, thank you.
Maddie, since we have some students here, do you have any advice for like what kinds of jobs are out there for students who might be interested in doing this kind of work? Where they might, I mean, besides the EPA, obviously, are there other organizations or routes you see in terms of professional career?
Yeah, so one is to go into consulting, right? So you could go and work, if you were in environmental science or engineering, you could go actually work in remediating and redeveloping these sites. Also getting involved with local real estate developers. So real estate development opportunities at that type of job, you're probably not just going to work at brownfield sites, but you know, there might be a real estate developer that has particular keen interest in brownfields redevelopment. That might be one path. Also, if you're a student and you're interested in this type of work, if you have a local ULI chapter, Urban Land Institute chapter, that's a good way to get connected to local developers who may be doing this type of work. And then also just working for a municipal or county government in like their economic development division. That's the type of office that kind of gets tasked with a lot of this brownfields work. Sarah? We can't hear you.
Yeah, sorry, Bryce had to allow me to unmute. So, Maddie, I really appreciate your presentation. I learned a tremendous amount. The one dimension I'm really fascinated by is that I didn't know communities could define or self-identify brownfield sites. You know, I just always assumed it's a quantitative process, right? You know, all these scientists with beakers out measuring stuff. So that was a really interesting dimension. And, you know, I really appreciate all of the examples that you provided. But I'm curious at this intersection of brownfields and social justice. In the projects that you've seen or have been involved with, how much has gentrification been kind of an unintended consequence of brownfield remediation?
I think this is the biggest concern folks have with brownfield redevelopment is potential for gentrification. Just because, you know, it's awesome to bring new development to a place and bring new revenue to a place, like in National City, where a lot of my examples came from. The city is super interested in doing brownfields redevelopment because they want those tax revenues to basically keep the city running, right? And so I think getting community organizations involved in the brownfield redevelopment process is absolutely key, because communities will not only help you identify where the brownfields are, they'll also tell you what the local assets are. So sometimes you might not need to tear everything down, and it would actually be kind of silly to tear everything down because you'd be destroying a community asset. And so you want to get communities involved to get that information on what's seen as a local asset, what's maybe seen as a local nuisance. And then doing value capture for local residents. So the market that I showed you in Oakland, by allowing community members to invest in that, you're giving the community opportunity to really extract direct economic benefit from that redevelopment. And so I think, you know, again, I hate to sound like a broken record with like, there's no one size fits all approach, But I really do think Brownfields redevelopment gives us a lot of opportunities to be creative, both in what we do with the sites, like how we think about redeveloping and what we build, but also the financial mechanisms we use to do that redevelopment. And by having communities centered in those conversations, rather than just being sort of an outside member that we consult with, hopefully we can build meaningful, equitable, inclusive transformation. And that's not the, for every good example of brownfield redevelopment you see, there's probably like 2 or 3 bad examples. And so, yeah, we just have to be careful about it. But by getting people meaningful seats at the table when doing brownfield redevelopment, I do think that's our best shot at building equitably. Thanks, Sarah, for your question.
So those direct public offering that you were talking about for that grocery store that they did that, how does that work? Is that just like you invest and it's like you get a portion of the profits, or?
Yeah, I think so. I think it works like almost like what's the website people use to raise money for things?
Oh, like Kickstarter?
Yeah, like sort of things like that. And it's actually funny, like you do see some examples of this on Kickstarter. So like communities will kind of take up this work on their own and put together a Kickstarter campaign. So there was one that was done, I don't know where it was, but they basically did a Kickstarter because they wanted to transform this vacant property into a park. And they were able to do it through the Kickstarter platform. And so I do think the Oakland market was very similar to that. I was not involved, so I don't know what the exact like profit sharing looks like. But yeah.
Yeah, cool.
Mm-hmm.
Any other questions or things folks would like to chat about? Maddie, what do you think the biggest hurdle communities face in terms of brownfield redevelopment? It seems like a lot of it is this identification of sites.
Identification of sites and then getting money. So like any sort of major brownfields redevelopment is likely going to require some hefty funds, right? If you do identify contaminants of concern that have the potential to impact human health, remediation is not cheap. I mean, even if excavation is kind of the simplest form of remediation, right? You dig it and you haul it away. But I don't know if you've ever tried to dispose of soil. It's not cheap. You have to I was trying to get rid of soil at my house and you basically have to beg people to take it away or pay them a bunch of money. And so if you do in fact identify true environmental contamination, I think getting the funds available to clean it up is the hardest part. And with brownfields, getting private developers to put up the money early on is difficult because it is seen as a riskier investment. And so we usually need to rely on government funds to kind of do that first step of making the site ready for development to come in. Yeah, so like in National City, the city paid for the site. They dug out all the old soil, but they were able to quickly turn it around and get a private developer on site and start getting some of that money back. But that first step is definitely the hardest.
And it sounds like sometimes cities have to take the lead.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yep.
Challenging.
Yeah, these grant programs are, they do offer a lot of opportunities each year. So we have to hope that they continue with the current administration, which I think they will. I don't see this program going away anytime soon. But that's really our best source for funds to kind of get started on this work. I think there's a question in the chat.
Does OU offer any courses on this topic? I think Robert Nairn, who was just here in the session, might offer a course in Brownfield Redevelopment. I do know that we've had some other faculty offer. I want to say maybe Dr. Little, did Tom Woodfin teach a class on brownfields? Are you there? From time to time, there have been some special topics, I think, but I think that there's a number of faculty who are interested and willing. And Kate, I think if you're interested, Dr. Swayne would certainly be happy to chat with you some more. She's a dear friend of mine. But yeah, the idea of recycling land is a genius idea. And we have so many of these spaces. I mean, I think Oklahoma City has one. We have some, obviously, because of our history of resource extraction, but you look across the country and there really are so many communities where either steel or other sorts of resource extraction occurred, where there's just stuff happening that we need to sort of remediate. And so great opportunities. I think we need to really think about like what that means here in Oklahoma. I don't know if we have necessarily a course right now, but I think it's something we could certainly think about. Bethany, sorry, I got it.
So I'm doing work with a small town of like a couple hundred people, and they're wanting to redevelop this site that was an old gas station. They don't know if the tanks are still there. So, you know, they don't want to do any sort of TSET funding grants, you know, the tobacco Oklahoma gives out for healthy living. They're like, we're not interested in that. Like, okay. So I'm trying to think of different grant opportunities for them. If they identify it as a brownfield site, are they then required to remediate before they do anything? Or can they, since they're just turning it into like a park, can they just like we're fine with not remediating? I don't know, like if they go down this road, I don't want them to be stuck with like, no, now we can't do anything until thousands of dollars.
Right. So I don't know as much about the Oklahoma context, but in California, we have an office called the Department of Toxic Substances Control, and we also have the Regional Water Quality Control Board. Do you guys have similar offices there? Maybe. Okay, so if there's underground storage tanks at the site, which it sounds like there is because it's a gas station, those tanks, unless they were never permitted, likely have a history with the Regional Water Quality Control Board, and they're going to be interested in tracking those underground storage tanks. And so you might want to just see what sorts of records are available through your regional water board or whatever the equivalent is there, because you might be able to uncover some preliminary information on what might be going on at the site. That being said, if like our Regional Water Quality Control Board finds out about a leaking gas tank or underground storage tank, they're going to try and identify a responsible party. So in the case of your site, it sounds like that would be the gas station owner. And they're going to try and hold that party accountable for the cleanup of the site, which for the community might actually be a decent thing because that party would be responsible for environmental cleanup, and then they could take it and recycle the land into whatever future use they envision being best, so whether that's a park or something else.
If this was a big corporately owned gas station, that'd be awesome. There is literally nothing on the land anymore that says,
it's
hey,
gone.
Station. Yeah, there is, well, there's the concrete, and you can see the little concrete barrier where they would have old style pumps. So it was basically the community being like, yes, this was a gas station back when. So who knows when that got torn down, if it got dug up, but that concrete pad doesn't look like it's been excavated underneath. So, but that's good. That's good information to look into.
Yeah, and these sorts of small gas station sites get lost all the time. Dry cleaners also get lost in the weeds all the time. So like the San Diego Regional Water Quality Control Board just wrapped up a project where they were trying to identify all historic dry cleaner sites in the county of San Diego. And they basically lost records on a whole bunch of these places. And so now that they've identified these historic dry cleaner sites, they're going to go back and try and find responsible parties for each of them and hold them accountable for cleanup. I don't know how successful they'll be in holding these folks accountable, because after years go by, people run out of money, things happen, you know how it all goes. But
Companies go bankrupt. Yeah.
it's not uncommon for these sites to kind of fade away, and we lose track of what's going on environmentally at the specific
Yeah,
parcel.
dry cleaners as being contaminating the site. So
Yeah, they use chlorinated solvents. So if you've heard of TCE or PCE, those chemicals are associated with dry cleaner operations. And so that's a big risk to
And
humans
back in the day, they
environment.
used to sometimes just get rid of it outside of the dry cleaner.
Oh yeah. Yep.
But I think a great question, Bethany. And I think that the example of the city buying that one property to remediate is an example of what happens if they can't find a responsible party, right? Sometimes then the city will step in and buy the property and use, unfortunately, taxpayer money to do the cleanup. But if they see the benefit of it being great enough, that all sort of washes, right? And then they redevelop it, try to turn it into something economically viable so that in the future it will then return that revenue back to the city.
Yeah. And that's also kind of the hard bit, is like, in order to get cities involved and willing to, you know, sometimes buy these properties and start the remediation process, they have to be convinced that there's going to be some environmental return later on. And so that can make things like park projects a little bit more difficult than maybe building a hotel or a business park, right? Like the park is just not going to generate the same tax revenue that a business park would. And so having, you know, powerful community activists that are well networked with one another just becomes even more important in those types of situations.
luckily the city already owns the land, so.
I don't know if that's good or bad, actually.
Listen, these people are do what they want to do type of people in small town, independent Oklahoma. They didn't have a mask policy when we went. They're like, nah, we haven't had one of those. Like, people come here to get away from the mask. I'm like, okay, Wild West out here. And but in that same, vein, they are very much like farmers have offered to lend their own equipment and people to, turn this site into what the city wants it to become. But yeah, trying to think of different funding opportunities for them. So I appreciate all your knowledge.
Well, thank you, Dr. Swayne, for joining us today in Oklahoma from San Diego.
Thanks for having me.
Hopefully you'll get to go out surfing in a little while.
No surfing today.
But thank you all for turning out today. It's been a great to introduce my friend Maddie to you all. And if you ever have questions about Brownfields, reach out to me. I can reach out to her. I can connect you with her, and she would probably be happy to chat with you. But thank you all, and have a wonderful rest of your day.
And I put my email in the chat if anyone wants to save that, if you ever need to get in touch with me, or if you're ever in San Diego, come say hi.
Yeah. Wonderful.
Thank you, guys.
Have a great day.